Many people, when they hear about this kind of research, are prepared to believe that attitudes and behaviors are commonly system justifying in their consequences, but they're not necessarily prepared to believe that people in general, and especially members of disadvantaged groups, are motivated to see the societal status quo as fair, legitimate, and desirable. So skeptics suggest that those who acquiesce are simply the passive recipients of ideology or are compelled by authorities to comply with the status quo, but they don't really believe in it. And I recognize that that these are plausible alternatives, but I think that in addition to being empirically inaccurate, at least in some cases, they drastically underestimate the prevalence of system justification tendencies, that is, the ways in which people actively and purposively, but not necessarily consciously, rationalize existing social arrangements. They also lead one to overestimate the extent to which system justifying beliefs will be responsive to reason and evidence. In the time that I have left, I want to at least touch briefly on 4 lines of evidence. And each one, I think, makes a progressively stronger case that system justification is a motivated, goal-directed process. Specifically, I will show first that system justification is linked to individual differences in self-deception and ideological motivation. Second, that situations of system threat tend to elicit defensive responses on behalf of the system. Third, that system justification leads to selective biased information processing in favor of system-serving conclusions. And fourth, that system justification exhibits several other properties of goal pursuit, including equifinality and multifinality, and I promise to define those terms when I come to them. Glad you got that. Not one of Harvard's most distinguished alumni, perhaps. So first, we have extensive evidence that personality and individual differences in the strength of self-deception, as well as specific ideological motives, do indeed predict attitudes and behaviors that are supportive of the status quo. One example comes from a paper that my colleagues and I published on fair market ideology, which we defined as the tendency to believe not merely that market-based procedures and outcomes are efficient, which many people believe, but also that they're inherently fair and just, which is not something that any economist worth his or her salt would actually argue. We also found that it's possible to measure this tendency as an individual difference variable with the use of items such as the following. The free market system is a fair system. Do you agree or disagree? Common or normal business practices must be fair or they would not survive. Profitable businesses tend to be more morally responsible than unprofitable businesses. And the most fair economic system is a market system in which everyone is allowed to independently pursue their own economic interests. We found in 7 samples of both MBA and non-MBA students at the University of Chicago, Stanford, Boston University, and NYU that the tendency to subscribe to fair market ideology was fairly widespread, and that it was significantly predicted by an individual score on Del Paulus's measure of self-deception and various scales designed to measure the desire to believe in a just world in which people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. We also found that self-reported political conservatism and individual scores on Jost and Thompson's economic system justification scale predicted scores on this fair market ideology scale, and suggesting that there may be some behavioral consequences of fair market ideology. We found that participants who scored more highly on the FMI scale tended to downplay or minimize the seriousness of Enron and Halliburton scandals and to recommend more lenient sentences for those involved. The second category of evidence supporting this notion that system justification is a motivated process will probably be the favorite one of our host, John Hanson, aka the Situationist. And it suggests that much as people respond defensively to threats directed at their own self-esteem and threats to their group identification, they also respond defensively to threats directed at the status quo. Probably all of you know that President Bush's approval ratings shot up 40 percentage points immediately after 9/11. even before he really had any time to do anything about the attacks or their aftermath at all. And it stayed, and his approval rating stayed in the stratosphere, around 90% for quite a while. But perhaps you didn't realize that Americans' opinions of nearly every other system-level authority and agency also became more favorable. According to the results of Gallup polls, approval ratings of Congress, the military, and the police also increased right after 9/11, as did trust in government to handle both domestic and international issues, although one could conceivably argue that 9/11 reflected, among other things, a failure of government to protect its citizens. But of course, there are always many influences on public opinion that are difficult to disentangle, so we really need to go into the laboratory to get at cause and effect relationships. We've developed several different experimental paradigms for manipulating a sense of system threat. Here's one version, which has been used in research with Aaron Kay. Participants are asked to read one of two passages ostensibly written by a journalist, and they're instructed to try to remember the passage for a memory test later in the experiment. Half the participants are exposed to this passage, which is intended to elicit high system threat, and it reads, "These days, many people in the US feel disappointed with the nation's condition. Many citizens feel that the country has reached a low point in terms of social, economic, and political factors. Ever since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, people do not feel as safe and secure as they used to, and there's a sense of uncertainty and pessimism regarding the country's future." The other half of the participants instead read this reassuring, system-affirming passage, which reads, "These days, despite the difficulties the nation is facing, many people in the US feel satisfied with the nation's condition. Many citizens feel that the country has reached a stable point. People feel safer and secure than they used to, and there's a sense of confidence and optimism regarding the country's future." So this is the low system threat passage. We find that compared to the low threat passage, the high system threat passage does not affect individual or collective self-esteem, but it does increase people's tendency to use stereotypes and judgments in a system-justifying manner, as the examples shown here suggest. For instance, system threat leads participants to see the powerful as more intelligent and the obese as lazier. And it also leads people in Israel to see Ashkenazi Jews as more competent and Sephardic Jews as less competent, just to take two examples. Recently, a pair of German psychologists conducted 4 experiments, and the effect sizes are illustrated here, in which they showed that increasing the salience of terrorism as a threat to the system led participants to score significantly higher compared to various control conditions on a German translation of our general or diffuse system justification scale, which contained items such as, in general, you find society to be fair, most policies serve the greater good, and in general, the German political system operates as it should. There's evidence then from multiple laboratories indicating that exposure to system threat induces people to respond defensively, showing stronger system justification on both direct and indirect measures. Okay, a third line of research suggests that people engage in selective, biased information processing in order to reach system-justifying conclusions. So specifically, 2 PhD students of mine, Alison Ledgerwood, Anesu Mandasodsa, and I, have found that people tend to see research evidence as stronger and more valid when it is seen as supporting rather than challenging the existence of the American dream, and that this bias is enhanced among those who are chronically high in economic system justification, among women, and under conditions of high system threat. So let me show you these findings in a bit more detail. We used an experimental procedure in which participants read and evaluated one study concluding that hard work and determination lead to success. That's the pro-meritocracy conclusion, and another concluding that there's no correlation. That's the anti-meritocracy condition. And for each study, participants read an abstract, a detailed methods and results section, and 3 criticisms and then 3 rebuttals to those criticisms.